We got this report about those American bases that were damaged in the region, at least 228 structures or pieces of equipment on American military sites. Is that a huge deal militarily, or is it mostly impressive on paper?
No, it's serious. For the Americans, having 16 bases in 8 countries where there has been damage, more than 200 pieces of equipment that have been destroyed or damaged, hangars, ammunition depots, that's huge, with some planes costing hundreds of millions. It's a real flaw for the Americans, but it's due to there being 2 types of missiles. There are ballistic missiles, which are normally, theoretically, the most difficult to intercept, but the Americans, with the Patriot systems and their allies, intercept them at 95 to 98%. So that's good. On the other hand, there's the low-altitude layer, drones, especially the well-known Shaheds that Ukrainians have been defending against for years. There's only a 60% interception rate. And a lot of these attacks are either carried out by these Shaheds or by pseudo-commandos who launch a small drone from 2 kilometers away from the base and get results.
How do you explain this lack of interception? Don't the Americans have interception systems against drones?
The Americans, like us who have suffered attacks and casualties in Iraq and also destruction in the Emirates, we are not prepared for modern warfare against drones. And that's why there's a big difference today. If tomorrow exchanges of fire were to resume, the Americans would still have their heavy Patriot defense system, and they have stripped Europe and South Korea a bit to replenish their stock. And the big advantage now is that there are 270 Ukrainians deployed on site, and it's the Ukrainians, with their Ukrainian methods, who will be able to intercept the Shahed kamikaze missiles. And the Ukrainians, they have between 90 and 95% success rate.
So can a drone saturation really break through American defenses?
American defenses, yes. Ukrainian defenses, no. And that's what's problematic. The Americans, I think they were a bit arrogant about their capabilities. They declined Ukrainian help last October, saying the Americans weren't prepared for the Shahed and didn't have the right systems. We know this because Ukrainians use Patriots and say it's the needed system, but the Americans refused. All the countries in the region, including the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, have formed 10-year strategic partnerships with Ukraine to gain Ukrainian protection against Iran.
Iran's military capabilities, a CIA memo contradicts Donald Trump. Xavier, this was revealed by the Washington Post. A confidential CIA memo states that Iran has kept a large part of its ballistic missiles. How do we explain that? We're talking about 70% of the stockpiles remaining intact?
Yes, that's what's hard to understand. The thing is, a large part of the missiles are actually not in silos outside. They're simply big trucks that come out of hiding, even if it's from hangars or inside mountains. They'll come out, fire, and then go back into hiding. And if you don't have a way to destroy it instantly, you actually don't know where it's going to go. You can't track it if you don't have a drone to see where it's going to hide. So even if the entrances to these tunnels have been destroyed, the Iranians, since the ceasefire, have cleared the rubble and now have the ability to bring them out again. And that's a real problem. If the Iranians actually still have 70% of their stock available, that means they have more vectors to attack than there are Patriot defense missiles left anywhere in the world. If hostilities resume tomorrow with bombings in Iran and the Iranians retaliated, the Americans would likely yield first. That's significant and very serious. That means the Americans can't afford to restart the war because they wouldn't be able to hold out in the long term. And economically, as we just said, the CIA also mentioned something interesting. Yes, the situation is catastrophic, the population is suffering, but they say the Iranians can hold out for another 2 to 3 months at the current pace despite the blockade. There will be plenty of economic problems. In the end, that's not very long, but definitely longer than what U.S. allies can handle in the region. All right, take care of your clients. I'm going back to my video.
Will there necessarily need to be a ground operation to actually reach and target these underground facilities or not?
But then either we leave the current situation as it is, we talk about a ceasefire with the sword of Damocles still hanging overhead, meaning they could potentially start again. The reality is that American and Israeli strikes, effective industrially, are stopping Iranians from resuming missile production. They have thousands of missiles stockpiled but can't keep producing them. That's the problem. It's China. China is sending precursors, fuels that make it possible to produce powders so they can start making fuel again, especially because liquid fuels are less. In short, you need powder to be able to launch quickly, on the spot, without being detected. Chinese suppliers are providing spare parts to keep Shahed drone production going. And the Shahed drones, unlike cruise missiles, can be built in a warehouse the size of our studio, so they're relatively easy to produce. The Americans will never be able to undermine Iran's Shahed drone production. Missiles might need to be destroyed at their source, since I don't see another way, but Iran will always be able to produce Shahed drones.
Can the United States really stop Iran's nuclear program just with airstrikes?
At first glance, no. If the facilities are really deeply buried, even if they're in mountains and buried even deeper, the Iranians will always dig further. And if they don't do it this time, they'll do it in 6 months, in a year, in 10 years. So in reality, airstrikes are only effective against sites that are poorly protected. If this regime remains in power for years, nothing will stop them from continuing work in even deeper underground facilities. Thus, the American goal, and particularly the Israeli one, is to topple this regime rather than just destroy those sites occasionally. They want structurally and in the long term for Iran to no longer be a threat, meaning that the regime is no longer the same, and to see a normalization of relations with all the countries in the region.
Another question is really about the Gulf countries. What positions will the Gulf countries take in the coming days? We know that there was an arms deal much larger than what was expected in the region for Israel and the Gulf countries, with a contract worth $25.8 billion. That also includes Patriots, which the Ukrainians had also requested, Xavier Teitelman, but also really these Gulf countries that were strongly affected by the Iranian response.
They realized that they didn't have the ability to respond and hold out in the long term, since Iran produces 600 ballistic missiles every year, which is more than what the Americans produce in Patriot missiles. They are trying to buy every Patriot they can find worldwide. And why not the other competing systems in China, in France, with the SAMP-T Mamba, for example, and also with Ukraine, which is back in the game with partnerships to provide suitable systems.
Pour les Shahed en particulier.
There will be, in any case, a huge flow of equipment that will have to go to the region, and I'm thinking of fighter jets, RR missile systems to also intercept cruise missiles. So I think these countries today realize that despite the American presence, despite American swagger, despite technological superiority, they simply hadn't anticipated being vulnerable and being able to suffer such significant strikes. These countries mainly fear that future attacks won't just target American infrastructure on their land, but also more on the systems for oil and gas production, and why not, also on water desalination equipment. In that case, obviously, the population can't survive.
The Saudis believe that Washington has dragged them into a crisis they can no longer control and that they are not able to contain. We know that Donald Trump eventually gave up on his military escort operation in the Strait of Hormuz at the rather firm request of the Saudis. They took the risk of saying no to Washington. How do you explain that?
They're even quite annoyed. The Saudis, the Emiratis too, they supported this operation, no problem with securing the strait, helping ships get out, very well. Once the Iranians retaliated, especially in Fujairah, the Emirati port, that's the other export route for hydrocarbons, and in other places in the Gulf, what did the Americans do? They said, no, it's nothing, it's a small thing, it doesn't call the ceasefire into question anyway, so we're not going to retaliate. And then the Saudis and the Emiratis said, but what do you mean you're not going to retaliate? We're under attack, but you're not responding to protect your operation and ceasefire, creating a problem. So there were a lot of phone calls, there was a lot of back and forth. The Saudis were so upset that they closed their airspace to the Americans and their base as well. So there were quite a few phone calls and everything went back to normal, in the sense that the Saudis said, okay, you can use it again, but don't pull that on us anymore, if I can put it that way. To get involved in an operation where we suffer the consequences of that operation and you don't protect us, you don't retaliate. So the Americans and the Saudis discussed this, but things got pretty heated.
Because these bases are essential for the Americans in this war?
They are not able to carry out bombing operations on Iran without these bases. But structurally, the objective is to secure the area, to carry out operations, sometimes counterterrorism, especially in Iraq and near Syria. So the Americans need to be continuously present to secure this oil flow. In this case, it means on the ground, they necessarily have fighter jets, they have refueling planes, they have infrastructure sites with radars to detect incoming missiles. And all of this, logically, the Americans did not expect to have to endure Iranian attacks. They expected continued air superiority as they've had for years because they ignored what happened in Ukraine. They didn't expect to have Shaheds, and they didn't expect that an Iranian infiltrator just a few kilometers away could launch a drone. All these bases today, just like ours, just like the Russians for Operation Spiderweb, we are not able to deal with the simplest attacks that exist, which are carried out with kamikaze drones costing €500.
Precisely, heading to Ukraine and Russia, Donald Trump announced tonight a 3-day ceasefire between the two countries, since there is a tense parade on the Russian side. In Moscow, on May 9th, no tanks or heavy equipment are being readied, while Ukrainian drone strikes are getting closer to Russian territory. Behind the Kremlin staging, some see it as a sign of weakness. However, there were rumors on the Ukrainian side that there might be strikes that day.
In fact, the Russians have withdrawn part of their theater defense, especially the Pantsir systems, which they removed from oil facilities to place them around Moscow. The first effect is that the Ukrainians have accelerated bombings on oil infrastructure, which was less protected, with results not seen in several months, and clearly they are much more effective. But in addition, 2 days ago, the Ukrainians wanted to get into Moscow, and they went through all 3 top layers of protection, one after the other, and they managed to hit a building that was only 3 kilometers from the Kremlin. So in the end, today, the Russians are in great difficulty. They fear being bombed even tonight before their big parade. And yesterday, when the Russians were practicing for their parade, just the men marching on the ground, they had air raid alerts while they were training. Today, there's real nervousness because the Ukrainians have become stronger. Since March, Ukrainians have fired more long-range missiles than Russians, so the fear has really switched sides between the two warring sides.
Ukraine,
which has targeted many enemy targets, as you mentioned, Xavier Teitelman. What kind of weaponry is it using?
There are 2 main types of missiles. There are the Firepoint missiles, called FP1, which are drones, and they have the Luty, which is produced by Antonov, and now it also has a special feature. They've improved its stealth, so the Russians can't see them coming anymore.
Are these Ukrainian-made?
They're 100% Ukrainian-made inside. There are some components they use that we could supply them with, but they have such quantities that we can't produce at the speed the Ukrainians do. There are between 200 and 250 long-range drones produced and launched every day by the Ukrainians. So it's huge. We can't even make the components to keep up with them. The second category is long-range missiles. Historically, they had scalp missiles, etc., but those are limited to 300 kilometers. The best we can do is 300 kilometers. The Ukrainians have the Flamingo missile, a 1-ton missile with a range of 3,000 kilometers, and today they've carried out strikes at over 2,000 kilometers with the first ground alerts in Christ that are very far from Ukraine.
Thank you both for being here in the studio.